Welcome to everyone who's joining us. Thank you for being with us. My name is Michelle Lay. I'm the Vice President of International and Alumni Programs at the Fund for American Studies. I'm a two-time TFAS alumna and have had the great pleasure and honor of working at TFAS for more than 2 decades. Today, it is a great blessing to be with all of you as I'm joined with a colleague and a fellow alumna for what I know will be a wonderful conversation as a part of our ongoing alumni webinar series. With that in mind, I do encourage you to follow TFAS on our social media sites and check your email regularly from TFAS as we'll continue to announce upcoming events. Before I pass on the conversation to my colleague, Dan, we've got just a brief survey that we would like, at least those, I know some of you have joined by phone, but for those of you who are on a computer, you should see a survey popping up soon. And we'd ask you just to take a few quick minutes to fill out your survey, just so we have a little bit of a sense of who some of our audience participants are. Wonderful. Thank you so much again. And it is my great honor and pleasure to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Dan McCarthy. Dan works with us at TFAS, and he's the director of the Robert Novak Journalism Fellows Program, as well as the Joseph Rago Memorial Fellowship Journalism Program. And Dan will be leading the conversation today with alumna Grace Olmstead. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I think you're in for a real treat because Grace Olmstead is one of the really outstanding young storytellers and journalists of her generation. She has published in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and she got her start, in fact, with a small conservative magazine called The American Conservative. And I had the privilege of being the editor who got to hire her, just a few short years ago. Now she is the author of her first book, Uprooted, Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind. And already I think this is having a tremendous impact. It's getting extremely favorable reviews, and an excerpt has run in the pages of the Wall Street Journal review section. It's a book I highly commend to you. One of Grace's achievements is that she has been a fellow with the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program. She was an Alumni Fund Fellow in the year 2015. I'm now the director of the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program. And this program at the Fund for American Studies provides year-long financial support for a talented rising young journalist to pursue a project of his or her choosing on some reporting topic of public interest to the whole country. And in the case of Grace, we have seen her project has borne fruit in the form of this book. And it really is, I think, a remarkably gripping narrative about, sort of her journey from the small town of Emmett, Idaho, to a very high pinnacle of journalism, and her return to her hometown, and her consideration of what has happened to the place where she comes from in the years since she left, and indeed over the course of generations. What kinds of changes have been brought about by economic development, by, in some cases, misguided government policy, and by the overall cultural changes we've seen in our country. Grace, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. It's truly an honor, and I'm excited to get to talk to you.
You know, I'm eager to talk to you about your background and about Emmett, but I thought perhaps we should begin with a question from me about how you would describe the book to a first-time reader, someone who's just discovered your work, someone who's seen your byline perhaps in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. They're interested in checking out Uprooted, and they're curious as to what it's all about. What would kind of the short pitch you would give them as to what would interest them in this production?
I think I would tell them that this is a book about indebtedness and interdependence. The fact that I grew up in a community where I was blessed to have many strong familial ties that also connected me to the land itself, and that grew in me a set of gifts that I was then able to bring with me to other places in the United States. But that as I grew, all of those things that were given to me as a young person drew me back home and really instilled in me a desire to find some ways to bless the community that blessed me. I began to ask myself, the older I got, what I owed to the place where I grew up and to the past, to the people who lived there before me, which is perhaps a strange question to ask in our age. We don't generally think in those terms, but living in a very conservative, traditional community, inspired in me this idea that indebtedness and interdependence were highly important, and that the health of the places that birthed us and were part of our growing up continues to matter even after we leave them behind. And so it's a process of looking and hopefully growing in discernment as I study the life of that community, both in the past and in the present time, and ask how I can hopefully be a part of its ongoing health into the future.
Excellent. So for the next 20 minutes or so, Gracie and I will discuss the book and also her career and her vision of the future. And while we do that, I encourage our audience today to submit questions to us. And you can use the Q&A function of Zoom in order to send us your questions. At the very end of our conversation, at the end of the Q&A as well, we will then have a book giveaway also. So you'll have a chance to hopefully get a copy of Uprooted yourself. And if you don't win the contest, I hope very much that you'll go to your favorite bookseller and pick up a copy. It's something I very highly recommend. So Grace, looking back to your origins in Emmett, Idaho, did you always want to be a writer? Was this an aspiration that folks from your small town would conventionally have? Or was it something that you only discovered over time, perhaps after college, that was a path you wanted to follow?
I think it is a desire that I always had. I actually wrote my first book in kindergarten. It was about a Christmas tree angel who was scolding the fellow Christmas tree ornaments for their materialism and consumerist view of Christmas. I don't recommend reading it. I'm sure it's been lost to time. But I loved writing books and reading books. And so it was always a part of my own aspirations for the future. I don't know how many people in my own small town community had the same aspirations. I did feel some loneliness because I was such a bookworm and such a nerd growing up. And I think that's one of the things that propelled me to leave. But as I note in the book, one of the very first storytellers and historians I ever met was my great grandfather, who is a farmer who had grown up in the same town his entire life, but really who dedicated much of his life to the tradition of oral storytelling that is very much a part of a lot of local folk culture and the transmission of stories about place. And so I really learned to value those local stories and that folk culture from him. And I find it very interesting that as a writer now, that's actually the direction my writing has taken, and seeking to preserve what he once shared with me through just the pattern of oral storytelling he had received.
So you moved across the country from Emmett, Idaho to Virginia for college. And then after college, you came to Washington, DC, where you became a young editor, working for me actually at the American Conservative and doing a phenomenal job. I think even there we had a sense that you were destined for greatness. But what was that transition like, going from small town Idaho to a state across the continent, and then going to the capital of the nation and being immersed in a political conversation and climate that may have been quite different from the red state America from which you had come?
The cultures and the styles of life are very different. One of the easiest ways to describe it, I think, is that pace of life back home was much slower. People just did not go as fast or have the intensity that people in DC tend to have, and that we were all very much interconnected. Idaho does not have a large population. It's quite rural, quite sparse, even still as it's growing. And so there was a very strong likelihood that if you walked into any coffee shop there, you would meet at least 5 people that you knew or who knew your parents. Whereas in DC, of course, you're in a bustling large city full of people who come and go quite rapidly. And so the style and pace of life was very different. I remember when my parents used to visit me in Washington, DC, I would just automatically start walking so fast, and they would always have to tell me to slow down to match their strides. Not so much a difference in age as at that point, a change in personality, that many people in DC are just going fast. They're very intense. My sister once remarked that she was on the metro with me and was wondering why everyone was so sad, which of course they weren't, but it's just much more natural to have a very serious demeanor in Washington, DC. But I really loved getting to interact with a much more diverse group of people, learning from a much larger body of intellectual thought, in large part thanks to the American Conservative, which was in many ways just an ongoing education for me as a young person, getting to interact with ideas that I didn't even know were available to a conservative at the time, much beyond what your generic view of Republican thought might be. And I have really loved getting to participate in the life of a city as well, enjoying its walkability, enjoying the great body of cultural beauty that DC has to offer. And so it was a wonderful experience. In many ways, for me, it was a lonely experience because I missed what I had left behind. But I would say that I wouldn't be the person I am today and wouldn't have been able to write the book that I wrote if not for the ideas and the people I encountered in DC.
You came to Washington, D.C., but you maintained a sense of the value of the place you had left. And you continued to have an appreciation for the virtues of rural America, and for that matter, just the wider country as a whole. And I know that, while you were working for me at the American Conservative, you took a keen interest in the work of Wendell Berry, and in fact, you interviewed him for the magazine. Tell us a little bit about how you continued to have this interest in the parts of America that so many folks in Washington, D.C. and in other urban centers on the East Coast tend to write off and neglect, and how the work of someone like Wendell Berry kind of influenced you in your development.
His work has been a continuing huge influence in my life. I encountered it first in college. I read his novella Remembering, which is ironically about a young man named Andy Catlett who leaves behind his rural farm community, becomes a journalist after college, and then starts writing about farmers. Of course, Andy Catlett returns home and becomes a farmer within that community. And so that is the point at which the ironic similarities diverge. But in reading that book in college, I recognized perhaps a lot of the stories that my great-grandfather had told me. I recognized the goodness of the culture and the membership that I had been a part of growing up. And I felt that initial sense of nostalgia and longing for what I had left behind that continued to animate a lot of my interests and my work going forward. I remember back in 2010, I think I was a sophomore in college at the time, my grandpa Wally sold the family farm. And that was a moment that I should have seen coming. And in many ways I did see coming, but it filled me with a sense of loss that kind of coupled with Berry's work made me realize that there was something very precious about my life growing up and the goodness and the inheritance I'd received that I wanted to continue pursuing through my writing and studying in some depth. And of course, that's what Mr. Berry has dedicated much of his life in writing to, is looking at the past of farm communities, the goodness that they maintained in place, and asking questions about how we can preserve and in many ways reform what is there. In Wendell Berry's work as well, you find this theme running through that rural America matters for its own sake, not necessarily for the resources it holds that can be extracted and used elsewhere, but for the communities, the cultures, the traditions, and for the health of the soil and ecology itself that remains in those places. And as someone who very much loves Idaho and loves the community I grew up with there, that resonated deeply with me. And it became something that inspired my studies as I went forth as a journalist and continued to seek to write about people in rural America. And so I was very blessed to get to interview Wendell Berry. And as I was finishing up that interview with him back in 2014, I think it was, he urged me that if I was going to write about farmers and about rural America, I ought to do so through my own viewpoint and through the viewpoint of my family. And now we have a book because of it.
Absolutely. And one of the things I think is most impressive about you as a journalist, I mean, you're a beautiful writer, you're an intrepid reporter, and one of the things I admire is the fact that you go out there and will talk to sources and get stories from, flesh and blood human beings. It's not just a hot take, it's not just a kind of summary of other people's thoughts. Instead, you're going out there and actually engaging with people and producing, really moving narratives of what they've experienced and of your interactions with them. And that certainly comes through in the new book, Uprooted. And you have been able to take your talents and to recognize when it is time to expand them and to reach the next level. And so I think I was very pleased at the time in 2015 to write a letter of recommendation for you to the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program. And at the time I was with the American Conservative magazine, and so were you. And now, I'm the director of the Novak program, and you are an alumna of the program. And so I thought I would ask you about the effect that the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program had on you as a developing writer and journalist, and how it helped to contribute to the creation of this book, Uprooted.
Well, when I first started thinking about this project, I was thinking in national terms. And I was thinking about the decline of small to mid-scale family farming throughout the nation and wanting to understand it better and kind of where we were at agriculturally as a nation, and to have a better handle on how the experiences of farmers on the ground were developing. But of course, that takes time and money for travel, neither of which I necessarily had at my disposal until I was able to get the funding through the Fund for American Studies to begin my Novak project. And as a part of that, I was able to talk to farmers on the West and East coasts, in the heartland and in the South, about what they were experiencing and seeing in their own communities, about the work that they were doing, and begin to look too at the policies that we've had at the national level that have helped either bring health to those communities, or for the most part, I would argue, tear down a lot of the resilience and flourishing that they used to have. And so the Fund for American Studies made that project possible and gave me the time and space and funds to begin the research that then eventually led me homeward to do a much more focused look at how all of these things affected a particular group of people in a particular region. And that is what my book is. But it was very important, I think, to begin large and to talk to a large group of Americans from a variety of rural communities, and then to begin to use the research and the knowledge that I grew through that experience to look at my own homeland and to understand it better as a result.
And tell us a little bit about kind of the balance you've been able to strike in your life as someone who was working very hard as a journalist at a magazine, then as a freelancer, writing for places like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, putting together this very impressive, first professional book, at least, not counting the book that was written when you were a little girl. And at the same time, also getting married and raising a young family, finding a home here in Virginia. There's a lot of moving parts to balance. And I think a lot of young people today, and for that matter, people who are not so young, feel kind of overwhelmed, and as if it's kind of an impossible task to fit these things together in a way that sort of helps them all. But you've succeeded in that. I was wondering if you had any advice for people who are trying to balance, kind of work and family, the sort of character development. I know you're someone who reads very extensively and sort of ambitiously and carefully as well. And that too is something I feel like a lot of people in today's very hurried world feel as if there's no time for kind of intellectual reflection and for the kind of literary self-study which leads one to have a deeper understanding of human beings. And you've balanced these things so well that I thought I would ask you to sort of provide a sense of how you did that and what you'd advise other people.
Well, you are very kind. I don't know if I always balance them all well, but I'm trying. It was an interesting progression, and I would say one that was inspired by the people who came before me, kind of deciding to set aside my full-time professional work in DC in order to be fully at home. But one thing I was reflecting on with my husband not very long ago was that we both feel that every decision we've made that's put our home first and its members first has resulted in a lot of goodness for us. And so that's something we've always made a priority, is that we make sure our home and our children and the health of both are paramount. And I had a great desire to be able to be as rooted in my home life and my family and my community as I saw in my parents, grandparents, and great grandparents. And so in a lot of ways, stepping away from full-time work and embracing a much more home-centric lifestyle back in 2015 when my first daughter was born made a lot of sense. But I also love that it gave me a lot of time for reflection on larger ideas. I didn't necessarily feel as chained to email or as to the 24-hour news cycle as I felt prior to that point. And one thing I still often tell people today is that one of the best times to ponder your next article or essay is when you're doing dishes, because your hands are busy and your mind is free to think and to ponder some of these big questions. And so I've really been blessed to get to do that. And I would say it's one of the best decisions I've made insofar as it's allowed me to really enjoy these years when my children are very young and to focus my energies with them. In terms of writing a book while being a young mom, that is almost entirely owing to the huge support of my husband, who's been more than happy to take some time off when necessary to watch them for me, to make dinners in the evenings, to watch the kids all through the weekend while I hold myself up in the office. All of the work that went into this book is owing to the fact that he helped make it happen. And so there's really a partnership behind it that is very important. And indeed, I didn't think I could write a book, and he's the one who convinced me that I could. So he has definitely been my partner in this entire enterprise. And so I would say, in terms of just setting aside the time to put home first, that also interestingly has given me time to think long and deep and hard on things that matter to me as well, and to hopefully be reading as many books as possible, and to not necessarily have to comment as soon as something happens in the news, but to step back and to ponder whether I have anything good to say about it. And then if I do have something I want to say, to take my time in writing it. And that's just something that's become more and more important to me also, as politics have become, it seems, rather bombastic and vitriolic. So hopefully, if I am going to say something, to say it well and to say it thoughtfully. And so getting to be in a time in my life where I'm working primarily from home and balancing all of my writing work alongside caregiving has been really wonderful in that regard.
So I have a couple more questions for you, but in the meantime, I want to mention to our viewers that they should enter their questions for you into the Q&A box here on Zoom's chat function, or rather on the Q&A function. And we look forward to hearing from them, as well as continuing to hear from Grace. So I'll move on to maybe a few questions about the book itself. And in particular, what are some of the difficulties and challenges facing Emmett, Idaho in today's economy, perhaps with today's sort of political situation and context the way that it is? What are the forces that are perhaps undermining the resilience, as I think you had said earlier, of places like Emmett?
One of the primary things I saw when I looked at the life of the town over time is that there had been homogenization and concentration in the realm of agriculture that really harmed these forms of resilience and diversity that used to exist there. And so you see farmers growing a less and less diverse array of crops, which results then in, of course, you could say, having all their eggs in one basket, which is not necessarily the most resilient form of enterprise that you might want to see. You also see that agribusinesses have become so concentrated. There's not a lot of options for farmers in terms of getting their product to market or having processing and distributing sources close to home. And all of that has had an impact both on local jobs and on the health of the farm town that Emmett represents, and also on the farmers themselves and how well they're able to continue to make a profit and to keep their farms healthy in the years that have passed. I look at a few of the local industry centers that used to exist in Emmett, and there's even more that I could have gotten into if I had had time, but it becomes evident when you look at the history of the community that whereas there used to be a lot of jobs available to people within miles of where they lived, all of that goodness, all of that health, economically speaking, has gone over the hill, as they say, because the town is literally in a valley. And so in order to get a job and keep it, you generally have to commute. And a lot of rural towns are turning into bedroom communities if they are holding people in place at all. Others are aging and graying and losing all of their young people to the degree that they will probably be ghost towns within the next several decades. And so I wanted to look at all of those forces of local resilience and empowerment that used to exist and ask some questions about how we got to where we are now. I think there's reasons both through the Farm Bill and federal policy and through the way that kind of unbridled economic concentration has just impacted the local resilience that used to exist. And I tried to at least, begin to look at some of these things, although as I'm sure you know, there's always more to be unpacked in a lot of these difficult, complicated questions.
And there are some rays of hope out there. I know that the Wall Street Journal recently ran an excerpt from the book, which talked about young people who actually are returning and trying to revive some of the places that otherwise have been left behind. Tell us a little bit about some of those more hopeful developments.
So it's very interesting looking at rural migration data. If you look at IRS data from 2016, 17, and 18, you see that even though there was a lot of out-migration in areas of 250,000 people or less, counties specifically of 250,000 people or less, there was also sizable in-migration, most of the time to meet or surpass the people that were leaving. And then when we looked at the pandemic last year, we saw that of young people aged about 18 to 29, we had more young people moving home than at any time since the Great Depression. So there's a large influx of people to rural areas, and there's a lot of young people who are returning to places where they grew up. Now, of course, with college closings and things like that, there are some of those young people who returned home because of COVID-19 who will now be exiting home again for college or for other reasons. However, I think there are a lot of small towns and other rural counties who are investing a lot of their efforts now in seeking to keep those people in place by expanding rural broadband, by revitalizing their downtowns, and doing other initiatives aimed at showing them that this is a beautiful and important place to live. In addition, in that article, I look at the work of people like Benya Krause and Lead for America, who are very much emphasizing the importance of living in a place not just for what it can give to you, but for what you can do for it. And the idea of a rootedness that is oriented around stewardship and love of the places that grew us up and gave us our lives, and then trying to give back to making them healthier, more flourishing communities. So Lead for America and Sarah Smarsh's podcast, The Homecomers, are both focused on this work and why it matters.
That sense of stewardship really comes through powerfully in your book. And I think one of the things that people will find so encouraging about Uprooted is, in some ways, it is kind of related to a book like J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. And I think many of the same readers will find your book appealing as well. However, you provide, I think, a very hopeful case, or at least a case which shows that if we understand the forces that have brought about some of the difficulties that rural America has been facing, if we understand what those forces are, we can then begin to, sort of look to a brighter future. Tell us a little bit before I turn it over for Q&A about what your own plans are. Do you have future books in mind, and what's kind of the next step for Grace Olmstead?
Well, that is a good question. The next step has actually been unfolding as this book has been published. I think you know, Dan, and very few other people do at this point, but more and more I'm getting to talk to. I got accepted to Oxford University to pursue a master's in English and American literature. And that's something that my husband and I are looking at very seriously if we can make the finances work. It would only be a 9-month program, so we wouldn't be uprooting our family for very long. But the benefit would be that I would be able to pursue various teaching possibilities in the future and begin to consider what the next step as a writer might be as well. I am very interested in continuing to look at regional writing and how it can inspire our love of place, and have been very inspired not just by Wendell Berry, but also by people like Willa Cather and R.S. Thomas, who really dedicated much of their writing to the same places over a long period of time. And so by studying their work and giving more of my attention to it and kind of sculpting out that time and space to do it in a reflective way alongside mentors, I'm hoping that I can then continue to write other books, hopefully better books as I get older on these subjects, and eventually, hopefully, to return home. All of that is, of course, always dependent on jobs and what opens up. But my husband and I both feel very much called to give back to the people who've raised us, and we want to be available to my parents as they grow older and to come alongside them. And so that's something we're very actively considering for the future.
Well, I've been privileged to follow your work almost from the start, from the time you left college. And Uprooted is really a culmination of just wonderful work you've been doing for a couple of years now. And it seems to me that you have, planted a tree which will continue to grow, flourish, and produce branches that will continue to fascinate readers for a very long time. And so I really highly recommend Uprooted to all of our viewers today. And I'm going to turn it over now to Michelle Lee, who has some questions from the audience that she will direct to you, Grace.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Dan and Grace, for sharing such a wonderful conversation with us. I apologize in advance to any of our alumni if we don't get to all of your questions this afternoon, but we'll try our best. Okay, Grace, we have a question from Jonathan. He says, can you speak to your recent op-ed in the New York Times about the need to rethink our food and ag systems? Do you think that a change in federal and state incentives is needed, and how that might be implemented consistent with rural and largely conservative principles?
It's such a wonderful question. Oh, and I hear a baby crying. He's well taken care of, I promise, at the moment. But if you hear a baby crying, so I have thought a lot about this and how basically the policies that we've seen farming family, and in many instances, a reliance on the federal government that is not sustainable and that hasn't encouraged healthy farm policies. And so in the book, I begin to consider what sort of policies might undergird more of a communitarian conservatism, which I think would serve these places much better and actually grow greater resilience at the local level in a lot of rural towns. I draw on the ideas of Patrick Deneen in his most recent book, Why Liberalism, is it failed or fails, Dan? Failed? Yeah, in which he suggests that one of the best ways we could do this is by, in our federal policies, not just funding or supporting individuals, but trying to support systems and associations. And so a lot of these farmers would be much better served by undergirding their larger ecosystems than by just funneling money into the growing of corn or soybeans. And so I kind of unpack a few ideas on how we might go about this. I also think that we could be doing more and should do more in the future in terms of conservation, and perhaps funds not going toward subsidizing, once again, corn and soybeans or crop insurance for specific crops, and more toward various forms of conservation or stewardship incentives. And I think the goal there would be to prove to farmers that we are interested in them staying in place for a long time and for caring for those places well, and that matters to us as much or more than just growing a cash crop. And the goal of that would, of course, be not only to replenish soil that's been heavily eroded and maltreated over time, but also to inspire people to stay in place and to see it flourish, and to enable them to do so when oftentimes the costs associated with changing the way you farm can be very prohibitive toward changing the way your operation works. So those are a few ideas in terms of federal and state incentives. And then, of course, I'm very excited to see collaborative farming enterprises and co-ops perhaps undergird communities that have been pretty hollowed out and be a part of the answer in terms of reforming villages that have been broken down over time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Grace. Our next question comes from Keith. He says, as you contemplate the changes in Emmett, have you thought of both federal and state policy options? Oh, I'm sorry, the question is where, that might mitigate some negative impacts of agriculture specialization? Are we facing a need to rethink capitalism and its unintended consequences?
I would say so. Some of the things I just said, I think would be part of impacting or changing agricultural specialization and its bad impacts on communities. I have really appreciated the work of the Open Markets Institute in suggesting that we need to reform the way capitalism has encouraged the growth of these monolithic agribusinesses that in many ways control so much of what is grown and where it goes to market and how it is sold, that now farmers have very little say in how they grow what they do. Seed industry is just one example of this. Packing houses, slaughterhouses, and the growth of king corn are some other examples. It seems like we really could do some very important work in fighting against the monopolization of agribusiness and thus empowering local farmers to grow things well and to have more say in what they grow and in the health of their land. One thing that's been pointed out through the work of Christina Hubbard and others is that farmers who plant seed that comes from Monsanto, which is now Bayer because of further monopolization and growth, don't even get to keep their seed. If they do, they will be charged and could be very severely punished by Monsanto Bayer for that. And oftentimes they are told exactly what and how they can grow and where they can grow it. The same with chicken producers. And so there's much that could be done to protect farmers who are often contracting out to these large companies, and to try and grow more diversity in the local and regional agribusinesses that used to exist. That would be a part of both strengthening these communities and enabling farmers to have more say in what they do and how they do it.
Great. The next question comes from Frank. What was the most frightening aspect of moving to the big city?
That's such an interesting question. I don't think I found it particularly frightening. The metro in DC is its own experience. I'm very glad I got used to it as an intern, so that once I moved, it wasn't as intimidating as it would have been otherwise. And I got to actually shadow a friend of mine who had already been working in the city, so that I wasn't completely lost. That probably removed some of the difficulties of the situation for me. Overall, I would say it was an incredibly positive experience, and I loved being in DC, and I still love visiting whenever I get the chance.
Right. We have a question from one of our participants who's joining us by phone. His name's Andrew. He says, my wife and I recently moved to rural Idaho, Teton Valley from Denver, Colorado. This is historically a farming community, but now is a big tourist area. Many families commute to jobs in Jackson, Wyoming. Farmers have been selling off land to developers who subdivide land, and new neighborhoods grow where barley once did. It really is a beautiful place to live, but very hard for working families to afford, as land and home prices have spiked. We see the challenges you mentioned firsthand: urban and suburban wealth coming in from Salt Lake, California, New York, and Colorado, people seeking a simpler life. Farming and service industry remain, but cultural challenges grow as newcomers and locals clash. Do you have suggestions for the newcomers and locals to find common ground?
This is such a good and important question in Idaho because it is growing. It's one of the few rural places that can boast that it actually is seeing a huge influx of people and the economic goods that come with that, and the cultural goods. But of course, there is this very important question of how do we preserve and protect what we have, including the land, as we continue to encourage growth? How do we grow in a way that is smart and thoughtful? Some of that is on newcomers, of course, to recognize and respect the local and regional history and culture that exists, that are in many ways drawing them to this place in the first place. I would argue that a lot of rural people need to be hospitable to the newcomers and to seek to learn from them, even as they may be very different politically or culturally than what they're used to. And Idaho could grow in that way as well. But in terms of farming and farmland and protecting it against just rampant sprawl, that is something I consider in the book and have written about actually for the American Conservative. And I think there's a lot of thoughtful stuff coming from Strong Towns and from other organizations that seeks to consider ways we can grow in a way that respects what exists and that preserves it. So this could be arguing for more dense and incremental growth. It could be an argument also for transfer of development rights, known as TDR programs, or for easements, although those aren't necessarily popular with a lot of people in Idaho because it's limiting what someone can do with their own property. The argument for it would be that if you put an agricultural easement on your land, you are preserving it for the next generation. You are enabling it to stay farmland and to not be paved over. And I think that we should and could argue for that in a lot of places like Idaho that are just growing so fast. If we don't take a more measured stance, we could lose a lot and then struggle to get it back.
Right. Mary Kay asks, it seems as though more and more power is shifting from cities and states to Washington. Plus, COVID has had a heavy toll on local businesses versus large national chains. Can small communities survive given the trends?
Well, I certainly hope so. Yes, it is always hard to see that political concentration and to a large extent the fixation we have on what's happening in Washington can harm local politics and policy and the empowerment that we want to see at that level. I think it's very important to note, though, that localism is becoming a very bipartisan cause. And there's a lot of interest on the left as well in a lot of these questions of how we can empower and strengthen local economic health and political health. And so you see a book like The New Localism coming from the Brookings Institution, I believe, in recent years, as well as the work of organizations like Lead for America that are trying to draw young people who are very talented to invest in their home communities, an organization that isn't necessarily left nor right, but that embraces people from both sides of the political aisle. And I think that there is a lot of recognition that in order to grow communal flourishing, to protect land, to inspire greater senses of political involvement and perhaps less rancor, a lot of these things are going to necessarily happen first at the local level, at the grassroots level. And that isn't a question that necessarily needs to be divided along partisan lines either.
Great. The next question is from Billy. What advice would you give to other younger people looking to return home, as you say? And how can young people bring the skills they've learned away from home back with them?
I do think it's essential to bring those skills with you, and have been very inspired by the ways I've seen people in Idaho who are returners invest their social and financial capital in building opportunities for the people who still live there. I think it's important to implement the same lessons if you're returning home that you would bring with you if you were moving to an entirely new place. You're going to need to grow community, especially if you've been gone from home as long as I have. You probably will need to start the process of getting plugged in all over again with perhaps a church, other local associations and clubs, institutions that will enable you to feel that you have a support system. In addition, I think it's very interesting to look at the ways that when you've lived in a different place, you can bring a whole diverse body of thought that might be new to the place where you grew up, and to hopefully learn from the place where you grew up as well with new eyes. But I've seen, for instance, a young person who left Oregon, which is the state next to me, next to Idaho, and they returned back to Idaho after some time and to Oregon and began a lot of initiatives to fight rural poverty and other issues. In addition, they've worked to build up a very successful farm and are very involved in a lot of other local initiatives. So everything that that particular individual learned outside of his community has inspired his actions within that community and has grown its health in a lot of practical ways.
Great. Josh asks, he says, hi, Grace. Many young people avoid rootedness because of challenges balancing family and work. Would more robust family leave programs, higher wages, and affordable childcare help strengthen our generation's ability to tie down?
I would argue so. I think that one of the most important aspects of this argument for, re-strengthening villages and rural communities is that the family has a very active place within them. And as many families have had to commute far from home in order to get work, or felt the economic anxiety and pressure that comes from living at a time when it is very difficult to support a family, it's going to be very important to support the sort of policies that enable them to live well within place, and for their children to grow up in that place and to be an active part of its life and health. And so I definitely think all of those policies could be a part of that effort going forward.
Wonderful. Kristen says, Grace, I loved the line in your book where you say your feet are in two places or on two soils. That is so similar to how I feel now, from growing up in a rural community to now living in DC. For those of us in similar situations, what advice would you give us to feel more rooted to our homes while being so far away? Alternatively, what are some ways we can become more connected to our current communities and gain a sense of rootedness?
Such a good question. One way I hope I'm able to give back to my home community is through this book and through the sort of long attention to place that it's required, understanding and loving my homeland more through the work involved in being a part of it through this, in this very small way, and learning perhaps more about the policies that would help it flourish and about the policies that have undermined it as well. I have very actively campaigned for people to start getting their beef from the Dills since writing about them and talking to them as part of this book, or to go to the farmers market and to support the Williams family. And so it's been very interesting to see how just that habit of long attention in the direction of home, learning more about the people currently living there, has given me a lot of more insights in how it could perhaps flourish in years to come, and a desire to see it flourish. But I'm very excited to hopefully use all of these skills that I've sought to build up while writing the book to now turn my gaze toward Virginia and the community I have here, to understand its history as a region better, to understand where it's at economically speaking, to be more involved in this local soil, and to be very much turning my attention and my gaze toward the place where my feet are currently planted. And so part of that involves being a part of the tree board, which I'm very excited to be a part of, and supporting local ministries, but also seeking to understand the history of this place is, I think, an essential part of that work as well. And a very fun and exciting one for me as a journalist. I think the more we emphasize local and regional history in our work, the more we begin to understand the intricacies of what makes places healthy or undermines them over time.
Great. Jonathan asks, how can we scale up efforts to promote the connection between rural farmers and urban consumers?
Well, one reason I mentioned the work of collaborative farming and farming co-ops is that this is meant to emphasize the fact that sustainable and regenerative agriculture is not just kind of a boutique or sentimental effort to return to farming as it once was, but rather that we're going to try and scale up farming of a very sustainable nature and make it more accessible to people who can't necessarily afford to shop at a farmer's market. And so by pooling their efforts, farmers would be able to actually cut some of their costs, or at least make them less constraining on their budgets. It would enable them to get their product to grocery stores as well as to farmers markets, and to hopefully have a wider body of members, whether through a community supported agriculture program, a CSA, or other efforts that enable them to be very much plugged in to the farms that are in their own communities. And so once again, the emphasis is on making it so that farmers aren't just doing this as nuclear families without support, but that rather they're beginning to build a village around them that enables them to take on a very concentrated food system, one in which it's very hard to break in or to do something different than the norm. And so I hope that that might be part of the process of making that product more accessible and helping people within a local community access the products that are being grown right next door to them.
Great. Ed is curious about how your book is doing and how the sales are going, and in the pandemic, what is it like getting a book out?
Oh, that's such a kind question. I have no idea. I've looked at Amazon to see how it's doing in a few different categories. It's #1 new release in rural sociology. Not a bestseller because J.D. Vance's book is also in that category, and I doubt I'll ever get to pass him in book sales. But I think it's doing well, and that's a very kind question. And if I find out more, I'll let you know.
Great. We have another question from Dina in Jordan, and she says, can this book be used as a research methodology in the area of the Middle East, given its diverse background?
I don't know, Dina. That's a fascinating question. I do think that one thing I've been very interested in following more in the weeks and months to come is the way that you see farms in places like India also fighting for their own economic sovereignty and their ability to support their own rural farming communities and traditions. And so I think if you look at a place like India and also farms throughout Africa, they feel the same pressure from Western agribusiness to change the way that they grow, to change their own systems of agriculture in order to buy a product that's being sold through international agribusinesses. And they are fighting against that very actively. And actually, India has recently had a tractorcade, very similar to the one that we saw here in the US in the 1980s. And so I think this is a global issue of farmers really wanting to stake out some space to grow their own economic resilience and to defend the way that they have done things for centuries, even as they seek to do them better. And so I'd be very curious to see if this is something that could be written to greater specificity in other areas of the world.
Great. Okay, we've got time for, I think, a couple more questions. Lauren asks, in living, researching history in the Arlington DC area, what are some of your favorite places, discoveries from the region's history?
It's been really interesting reading more about Loudoun County in just the last several years, because that's where I live now. And I always thought that perhaps Loudoun County had a similar history to that of my own home community, as a place that was full of smaller scale regional agriculture, and then slowly was turned into a bedroom community. But the fascinating thing I've been learning is that this area has always been a bedroom community for DC. It has been since the 19th century, when the train, the W&OD, would bring people out for the summer or for their long weekends, and they would be in their homes out here in the countryside and do their fox hunting, and then go back to work in DC once the new week began. So it has a very different set of rhythms and a very different history. There are some parallels, but it is of course unique, as every place is unique. And so it's been really fascinating looking at a lot of that. I also loved living in Alexandria for quite some time and observing its life as a community and learning from its built environment and the way it's sought to preserve its streets and its mode of urban development. And so that's something I got to work on a little bit once again at the American Conservative as part of their new urbanism project. And I really enjoyed that as well.
Wonderful. Lauren asks if you could comment on the tendency by the intelligentsia to devalue faith, as it might ridicule rural Americans and many of the fine traditions inculcated there.
You say devalue faith?
Mm-hmm. And faith traditions. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It is absolutely essential to look at the health of the church, or of churches and of religious faith when you look at these communities. It is one of the most resilient institutions over time. And it's one that inspires the greatest sense, oftentimes, I think, of belonging and of stewardship. And Tim Carney does this excellently through his book, Alienated America. And I know he's also a Novak alumnus. But one thing he highlighted that really stood out to me in that book is that if churches are healthy, communities are hopeful. Where they lack that health, you begin to see despair creeping in, and a lack of neighborliness and community involvement as well. And I would definitely say, as I looked at the life and health of Emmett, I was looking at its churches. And because I focused on farms and the life of the town as a farm town, there were a lot of things I didn't get to include in the book. But it was interesting to see how over time, not only did people commute out of Emmett for work, they actually also commuted out of Emmett for church. And so I was very curious how that impacts people's feelings of community belonging, of health and hope in place, if they're no longer worshiping together on a regular basis. And one thing that was very important for me to note was how involved my great-grandparents were in their local church over their lifetimes, because I think that was absolutely indispensable to the ongoing health of their community.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much. And I am sorry we didn't get to all of our questions this afternoon. But before we get to our book giveaway, I wanted to ask if my colleague could share the results of the survey that we did at the beginning. Hopefully you can see this. Okay, so this is interesting. Almost 48% and 48% on never have lived or have lived in a rural community, almost half and half. Higher percentage, 62%, had parents living in a rural community. And far and away at 62%, the option that most described our alumni who were with us today is that they grew up in an urban suburban community and still live in an urban, suburban community. So perhaps just sort of an interesting snapshot for these conversations. As Dan mentioned, we're pleased to offer a couple of copies of Grace's book. So for those of you who are interested in receiving one of the copies, we're going to have sort of a little simple contest. You're going to use, for those of you who are on your computer, your chat function. And I'm going to give you a question. And for those who can correctly and most quickly answer the question, we will then get in touch with you. My colleague Jane Mack will get in touch with you about how to get the book to the rest of you. Although I'm sorry, someone just said that the chat function may not work. So I'll tell you what, why don't you use the Q&A? You can use the Q&A function. Okay, so the first question is, what year was TFAS founded? Has to be quick and correct. Okay, I think we have Frank as a winner. So Frank, we will get in touch with you about getting that book to you. All right, so the next question is, what?
You got to tell us the answer, Michelle.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Roger. Thank you. TFAS was founded in 1967. The first institute took place, though, in 1970. So what large festival is currently happening in Washington, DC? Okay.
A quick response on the
and we've got
chat
Rochelle, I believe. It is the Cherry Blossom Festival. All right, well, congratulations to both of you. And as Dan said, though I'm sorry we can't send copies to all of you on the webinar today, I do highly encourage you to go to your favorite booksellers and purchase this amazing book. I would say get at least two, one for yourself and one to give as a gift. It's a fantastic gift to give. Dan's got it there. Perhaps I'm getting some books for some friends for Easter, so this might be a good option. Well, again, thank you both so much. And before, as we close today, Roger Ream, president of the Fund for American Studies and also a fellow TFAS alum, would like to offer some closing remarks.
Oh, well, thank you very much for joining us. I should mention again the title of the book, which is Uprooted, Rediscovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind. Thank you so much, Grace, for joining us this afternoon, at least this afternoon on the East Coast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure. Great insights, a good discussion. We hope to have these webinars each month for our alumni, where we are open to suggestions of topics and speakers for our discussions. Please send them to Michelle at tfas.org. That's her easy email address, Michelle with 2 L's at tfas.org. We have a lot of Novak book authors and other alums who've written books and are experts on interesting topics. So you can expect some really lively and interesting programs like this one in the future. I just wanted to add, in connecting to what the themes of today's discussion were, is TFAS has always had a commitment to accept students from all types of colleges and universities. We don't specialize in looking for kids at Ivy Leagues. We take students from large state universities, community colleges, private schools, parochial schools around the country and in every single state in the union, as well as international students. So many of our students come from rural areas. It's a great experience for them to interact with different people from other parts of the country. And we're committed to developing leaders, not just here in Washington for our country, but as we've always said, and for the life of our communities around the country. So if we're in the process now of recruiting for this summer, applications are running very strong. We expect to have a full class, and we're also offering a virtual program for students who won't make the trek here to Washington. So if you can help us, please support our scholarship program so we can make sure all these students can join us this summer. You can support TFAS and our alumni scholarships by going to tfas.org. Well, thank you. We hope this helped contribute to a search for answers, for finding common ground, great questions from everyone, and we will look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Grace. And everyone, God bless you. Have a great week.